Welcome to Envision IT's Microsoft 365 Maturity Model webinar series. This is the first of a three-part series on adoption and change management and how your organization is adopting Microsoft 365. My name is Peter Carson. I'm the president of Envision IT, also an Office Apps and Services MVP. Contact information is all up here. We're going to be sharing the slide deck and recording up on the event page after the event, so you can reach out and contact through that. I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Eric. Go ahead and introduce and take it from there.
Thanks so much, Peter. Hi, everyone. Eric Riz here. Great to be here. Thanks so much for tuning in. It's great to be here to have the opportunity today to speak to you about what really is a passion project of mine, which is Envision IT's Microsoft 365 maturity model. I'm a principal consultant with Envision, and having 6 years as an Office and Office Apps and Services MVP under my belt, I can tell you that this maturity model is really something that is both needed and deserved in the industry today. Certainly looking at the evolution of what Microsoft coming out of Office 365 is now doing with Microsoft 365, organizations are so in tune with what they're doing from a day in, day out perspective. But what really needs to happen is truly get that evolutionary maturity model curve in place in order to understand where they're going and, most importantly, where they've been. Personally, as you can see on screen, I'm a speaker, well-known speaker and author in the Microsoft space, having, I can't believe it says 20 years experience, but certainly Microsoft Teams today is a passion of mine, and both from an implementation perspective as well as strategy and governance. These are true passions of mine, and please, as you can see, reach out on Twitter or via email at the information you see on screen. Now, when we look at the model itself, which you'll see in just a few slides, there's really 5 stages to the evolution. Whether you start off with informal, ad hoc, consistent, proactive, or optimized, understanding where your organization is and where it's going is truly the genesis of this conversation. Now, let's start with real conversations. Everybody starts at an informal setting. Everyone starts in such a way that it's the low-hanging fruit conversation that everybody speaks to in consulting and in practice today. If you're using email and you know how to send and receive email, then you're informal, and that's great. But when we look at the maturity model and the principles that we've built this upon, the questions are really more focused on what you're doing with the information and the content at an organizational level in order to interact with your colleagues on a day in, day out basis.
Thanks, Eric. I'm going to pick it up from here. And the beginning of the conversation is what Eric alluded to, this idea of what to use when. Everybody's familiar with Outlook, everybody's familiar with using email. And honestly, over the last several months, as a result of COVID and everybody working from home and remotely, you're likely familiar with Teams or counterparts from a remote meeting and collaboration perspective. And really what we want to talk about here is as we look down this matrix, we're not going to go through all the details in this session right now. It's really looking at a number of the key workloads across the top. So Outlook and Teams from a communication point of view, SharePoint OneDrive from a document collaboration perspective, OneNote from a note-taking, Stream from a video portal, sort of a private YouTube, and Planner and To-Do from a task management point of view. You'll see in a lot of the rows, there's multiple asterisks. And that's typical for Microsoft. They give you a lot of choice, which is good and bad. It can open up lots of different options. It can also cause confusion within the organization. If half of your project team is using Outlook to communicate and the other half is using Teams, that's obviously not going to be effective. So you need to decide organizationally, what sort of guidance do we want to give our organization around what to use when? And that's really what the maturity model is about, is to look at different scenarios and understand, how can we better make use of these awesome tools that Microsoft's provided as part of 365 and really optimize how we leverage them as an organization. So what we're going to do is take you through a couple different scenarios, some day in the lives, and then dive deeper into the maturity model from there. But what I want to do is actually drill into a couple of scenarios and say, let's go a little deeper on this. And let's start with the communication scenario. This is an obvious one. In the past number of decades, email has become one of the predominant methods of communication. In fact, later I'm going to give a little demo of how I use Teams myself, and you're going to see a bunch of unlistened to voicemails. Not to this day, I haven't completely listened to those. SMS and Teams are taking those over as well. So if we think about it from a maturity point of view, for somebody that's not working in a modern way, email tends to be their primary method of communication, or potentially their only method of electronic communication. Text messaging is more ad hoc. That tends not to be a corporate enterprise way of communicating, but often in a lot of organizations that becomes sort of a back channel alternate way to get people is actually by sending texts back and forth. But as you come down the maturity and say, okay, well, let's introduce something like Teams to an organization, that very much becomes an alternative to things like email and text. And when you first light up Teams to an organization, people use it very much like they would use text. They have a chat feature there, they can look people up, and they can instant message back and forth. And it works very well from that point of view, but you're not really leveraging the full value of the platform at that point. You can start to expand that and say, well, I'm going to do group chats, just like you can do group SMS text messaging, and have multiple, 3, 4, 20 people on that group chat. But again, that's not the ideal way of working. Really what you want to move towards as an organization is the more formal concept of channels and conversations within those channels. So creating teams for projects, for departments, however you want to structure that from an information architecture point of view, and managing your conversations within those channels. And that's where you really start to see the big power of Teams. And it's around that historical knowledge that those messages that are going back and forth are not sitting in people's inboxes, they're not sitting in people's phones as SMS text messages. They're there and available for the organization to see, so that anybody that belongs to that team, which doesn't have to be the whole organization, has visibility to those conversations. This concept of working out loud is a term that's been coined in a couple of different contexts, that, hey, Eric and I may be communicating back and forth about something, but those conversations that we have may have value to people outside of the two of us. So rather than doing an individual chat, let's do that as a channel conversation. And there's a lot of value to the organization doing that. So as a maturity model, we'd like to drive people down this funnel, from doing everything in email to saying, okay, how can we adopt something like Teams, and ultimately within Teams, things like channel conversations to get better value for the organization. So that's sort of one scenario from a communications point of view. We see the same thing playing out from a documents perspective. Historically, a lot of people just use their local C drive, their My Documents on their laptop, on their desktop, and that's their repository for the documents. That's actually very scary from a number of things. One is, it doesn't lend itself to sharing. If people are sharing those documents, they're typically attaching as attachments to emails and sending them to people. And don't get me started on the many versions of the truth and all the versions of those documents that result when you start using your inbox as a document management tool, which is a really bad idea. The other side to that is that there's no disaster recovery likely around that. If you lose your laptop, those documents are gone. So I mean, you want to be working against some sort of central repository, whether it's traditional file shares or cloud-based storage. So I mean, lots of organizations have had file shares for decades. Unfortunately, they get to be a bit of a dumping ground with nested folders deep in. That often is a project in of itself, just unwinding that, cleaning that up, saying, okay, how do we move that to cloud-based storage, which are things like OneDrive and Teams, and TeamSite being the primary part of that. You've got a personal OneDrive as part of Microsoft 365. You can keep your documents in there. They can still be synced to your local machine, so that when you're offline, you're moving around with your laptop, you've got them available to you. But as soon as you're on the internet, they're backed up into the cloud, and the whole disaster recovery thing becomes a much better scenario. You lose your laptop, assuming it's got BitLocker and security on it, nobody can make use of those documents, but you haven't lost them. They're still up in the cloud. You get a new machine, set up sync, boom, you're up and running in an instant from there. So it's a much safer way to work. But ultimately, if you're sharing a lot of documents with other people, even if you're sharing links to your OneDrive, you start running a project out of your OneDrive, that begs the question, well, what, really, that should be in a team site, which could have a team associated with it for your communications, and it all starts to fit together nicely from there. So the same sort of evolution from a maturity point of view of locally working on documents and attaching to emails, to keeping them into a file share that lots of people have been doing for a long time, to moving that to cloud-based OneDrive and team sites through that evolution. So that, again, is another piece of the maturity model. And then the third scenario I want to is around meetings. You know, it's kind of funny. We're using a Citrix product to do a webinar about Microsoft 365 that includes Teams and the ability to do meetings. The reality is Teams still has some gaps from running a public webinar like we're doing here today in terms of me being able to see all the attendees and do Q&A and polls and things like that. So we're still using GoToWebinar for now, but all the other meetings that we run at Envision IT are run through Teams. And you know, initially, obviously, you know, most of people's workforces today are familiar with joining a Zoom meeting or joining a team meeting and participating in that conversation. But you know, did they share their webcam? You know, there's a lot of value to not just being a voice on the phone, to actually having the webcam view there. People are more attentive. You get that body language going back and forth. It's actually really important. And then sharing screens. You know, ran into a problem with a client this morning where wanted to share a screen, walk through a budget and a project update, couldn't get the screen sharing working on the other side. Not sure what the issue was because kind of partway through a Microsoft 365 implementation there, so Teams hasn't been lit up there yet. And we had to actually email an attachment and go old school on that one. Not a fan of doing that because it's very hard to be interactive from that point of view. That ability to share live like I am with the PowerPoint presentation right now is an extremely powerful tool. But then we're actually recording this session. Now, if we were doing this as a Teams meeting, you know, I could record that, and when I finish the meeting, there'll actually be a chat message in the Teams meeting saying, hey, your stream recording is being processed, and then another message will come through when that's ready and available. Depending on how long the meeting was, you know, it might be a minute or two, it might take a little bit longer to do that processing. It's actually really cool because it not only processes that video and makes it available through stream for anybody to be able to use on any device, from a very friendly point of view, but it actually does a transcription. So everything I'm saying, if this was a Teams meeting, would actually be transcribed and be searchable. So if you wanted to search about, hey, when did Peter say this or that in that presentation, it'll jump you right to that spot in the presentation. So being able to manage things in stream and maybe tag them so they're easy to find later, associate them with a team or a team site, you know, again, moving along on that maturity model. And then OneNote, if you've heard me talk before, you know I'm a big fan of OneNote. We use it extensively at Envision IT. You know, the ability to keep meeting notes in OneNote and make that available for everybody in the team. Ideally, that OneNote should be in the team site that's associated with the team for the meeting, and it all kind of fits together nicely from that point of view. So let me take you through a bit of a demo of how we use Microsoft 365 at our site. I'm not going to say we're awesomely mature. I mean, we've still got lots of room for improvement from that point of view. Actually, in next week's session, when we're going to talk more about analytics, I'll actually show you under the cover on how we're doing from an analytics point of view. And there's some lessons that I wasn't aware of that I learned doing that process about how maybe we can improve how we're using Microsoft 365 in there as well. But let me actually bring up my Teams client here. I'm assuming people are generally familiar with Teams. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into the details of how it works, but you know, I've got all my different teams that I belong to on the left-hand side here. And what we've done in Envision IT, and this is actually a really important question that we work through with all of our clients as we're rolling out Microsoft 365, is what does a team represent in your organization? It's different for every organization. And what are the channels within a team represent? What we decided in Envision IT, the first part of the answer is pretty common to most organizations, is that we'll have department level teams within our organization. So we're a consulting and technical development company. So we have a consulting team, we have a development team, you know, we have your typical HR, infrastructure, management, marketing teams. That kind of makes sense in most organizations. And then the piece that's a little different for us as a consulting organization is, you know, we work deeply with individual clients, and for each of those clients, we do typically multiple projects with them. We say, okay, well, let's create a team for each client, and let's create channels to organize both the documents and the conversations around projects for those clients. And the reason we did that was we said, well, we didn't want too many teams. We don't want to create a team for every project for every client. That's too many teams to belong to. Let's keep it simpler. We don't run that many projects for any one client that the list of channels is going to get too long. And Teams has a nice ability to hide channels that are inactive. So if a project hasn't been worked on for some time, it's still there, but it's not front and center from that point of view. So we can see here we've got a couple different projects. This is actually a philanthropic project that we're doing. So I use it from a demo point of view. There's nothing sort of too hidden inside of here. I can come into my general tab and see all the conversations that are happening back and forth around this. And then in Teams, you've got tabs, and this is part of our maturity model as well, is, have you embrace Teams as an app platform that you can actually make use of the tabs that are there. By default, you get a posts, a files, and a wiki tab. One of the first things I do on a team is I get rid of that wiki tab. In fact, that's now part of our template process. That we have a provisioning process that creates teams for people, and it removes the wiki tab, and it puts the OneNote tab in there. OneNote and Wiki kind of serve the same purpose. Like I said, I'm a big OneNote fan. It makes it available not just in Teams, but in my OneNote client, on my desktop, on my laptop, on my iPhone. It's just a much better way to manage things. And we have things like project highlights that have links and such that we need for the project as a whole at the top of the OneNote here, and I can expand that out. And what we've done is OneNote has a concept of sections that you can use to group pages of information together. And we said, well, hey, we've got this concept of channels in Teams. Let's align those together. Let's create sections for every channel. So when I go into the SharePoint Spaces channel on the project, and I go to OneNote here, it actually takes me to that section in OneNote as well. So it keeps things nicely organized and aligned from that point of view. I should do the same thing from a stream point of view. So if I come into my stream tab here, what we do is we create channels in Stream, which unfortunately are not the same as channels in Teams. They're disconnected. But again, with a little best practice, you can align those together. And I have a general channel for Stream that's associated with my Teams channel. What we do is we tag videos in Stream to that channel. And then in this tab in Teams, those videos show up. So if I want to look at the past conference calls that we had on this particular project, I can jump into these very easily right within Teams itself. And likewise, if I want to see what's happening in Planner from a task management point of view, we've got the Planner plan embedded right into Teams here. And this part of Microsoft's vision is to make Teams itself an app platform. It's not just about Teams, it's about pulling in all the other pieces, which may be other 365 pieces, or they could be outside applications altogether as tabs in your Teams interface. So you can basically live in Teams and do all your work through there. And ultimately, I think their goal is to sort of replace Outlook as your place to go through here. I come in, I treat my activity feed in Teams much like my inbox in Outlook. It's my chronological list of everything that's coming through here that I can react and interact with. I've got my one-to-one chats, which is where people organizationally typically start from in Teams, and you can see Eric and I are chatting back and forth, getting ready for this session. There's not a lot of organizational value to hanging on to this, so this sort of conversation makes sense in Teams. If we were talking about the presentation itself, it's actually back in the consulting team where we're working on this work. I can see my calendar, which has all my integrated Outlook in there. Probably like a lot of people's calendars these days, you kind of get meeting to death. We're actually using Teams as our phone system as well. So I have a direct inbound dial number. You can call that number, it'll ring on my Teams. Please don't do it right now because it will live ring for me. But nice thing is I've actually delegated with Amanda, so it'll ring on her Teams as well. And she can actually answer that call for me and broker that for me. So you can see I've got kind of everything about what I'm doing in here right in my Teams interface. So Eric, are you back online now? Or did we lose you entirely?
Mr. Carson, can you hear me?
Yes, you are there.
Excellent. This is fantastic. So I just want to share a couple things. First of all, we lost you for the first few minutes of the conversation. I don't know if you and I had conflicting mics or something, but we can chat about that afterwards and figure out how to move this forward. But great to be here. I suppose since we couldn't hear you, I imagine you did a wonderful job of introducing me, and thank you so much for that. Let me spend a few minutes chatting through some of the data and the life scenarios that Microsoft has been so kind to put together for us. And these are widely available on the Microsoft.com website as part of the adoption and change management content that Microsoft has really been putting a lot of effort and time into over recent years. So there are a number of these, somewhere around 30, that are available. And what we want to focus on here are the various interactions that the average user is leveraging on a day in, day out basis. So Peter just did a great job of showing you what happens internally within the Teams environment at Envision on a typical day. This shows you some of the more detailed interactions that, in this case, Justin is doing as a program manager in his day in, day out basis. So you can see at 7 o'clock, he starts off checking Teams and Outlook mobile to get his day going. Now that obviously shows the dependency on the mobile app and mobile integration, which means there has to be a policy set up for usage for users to use their mobile apps for business purposes. At 8 o'clock, he checks out his activity feed, which is really, as far as Envision is concerned, the activity feed is your modern day inbox. That's where you get notifications. All of your app mentions show up in the activity feed to ensure that you are up to date in the content that's being really noted around you from a notification perspective. At 12 o'clock, on his way to the cafeteria, someone tells him about the collaboration experience that's happening within Teams, and Justin's very excited about that. He wants to learn more. When he gets back to his desk at 2 o'clock, he takes a look at a presentation that he's working on and works one-to-one, likely through the Meet Now feature that you'll see shortly in Teams, in order to work on that presentation, much like Peter just showed you he and I do, and then get that into from chat back into the channel for final review. At 3:30, he makes the final updates to the particular Excel file and some fiscal budgets that he's working on, and he does that within the Teams experience, and he does that right in Excel. So everyone on the call likely knows that it is a full experience that gives you the app integration, whether through desktop or online, for all of the Microsoft 365 applications that you're used to. Then at 4:30, he gets the go-ahead on his presentation, and he excitedly presents that information as an announcement in a particular post in his Teams environment. So a lot of integration there across the platform. You see that he's working both with Excel, not just with Excel, but also with Teams and Outlook. He's working with Excel, he's working with PowerPoint, he's doing a lot of meeting and one-to-one connecting with peers, and he's also using OneNote as well. On the next slide, you'll see some examples of what the day in the life might look like for someone who is involved more in the sales capacity. 7:45, in this case, we're talking about April. April starts off looking at CRM. She looks at Dynamics, for those of you that are using Dynamics CRM. She's doing that, and at 8:30, she starts looking at the Power BI dashboard tab within Teams, and you can see that April's looking at a lot of data and a lot of integration within the bots that they have enabled through Power BI, through Microsoft Teams, and she's doing a lot of various things, getting a lot of information from a data perspective throughout the platform. And really, that's what the focus of this is from Microsoft Teams perspective and a maturity perspective, is now that Microsoft Teams has presented itself within the Microsoft 365 stack as really a place to get work done and a place to really demark your day from a day in, day out basis. April is really able to use the Teams experience to really hone in on all of her day in, day out tasks, and all the apps and all of the integration points that she has come up through the Teams environment. So at 11:30, she works with the meeting experience. She records that in stream, so it's available afterwards. And as Peter mentioned, it can be searched following to ensure she has some permission set up. At 2 o'clock, she actually creates a new team, so she has the permissions to do that in Teams, and then adds some of her teammates as well as other subject matter experts to get input and work together on a proposal. She then works again with the stream experience to ensure that her meeting recordings are available and to take notes on some of the meetings that have taken place. At 4:30, she updates Planner, so Microsoft Planner being a rich-enabled advanced to-do list, somewhere between an extensive to-do list and an enterprise project management suite. Very powerful to manage day in, day out tasks and teams. She also mentions her team members to ensure that they're aware of the tasks that they've been assigned to and the changes that she's made, as well as the ability to share her or their feedback. 5 o'clock, she's had a great day, so she's excited to close a particular deal. She navigates back to that Dynamics tab and then updates the lead status to the opportunity stage. In our final day in the life, you'll see the day in the life of a particular project manager. This is Jamal. Jamal, once again, much like the other people in the day in the life scenarios, is using the mobile app to work remotely as he travels between various places. Hopefully we'll be able to do that again very soon. At 8:30 in the morning, once in the office, he looks at the Azure DevOps dashboard. This is the content he's looking at more from a dev perspective, looking at tasks, looking at projects, looking at all the information that's available to him through that dashboard, and he notes some trends that are concerning. So at 9:30, he has a meeting to review those data points with his team members. He mentions again specific people in order to get their attention. Then at 11:30, he joins a project review meeting. Live in Teams, he shares his screen. He has the ability to do that. He navigates to the Planner tab to review those key activities by owner, and he adjusts due dates based on the schedule changes that have happened. At 2 o'clock, he prepares his meeting notes from the meeting. He replays the Teams-based meeting in stream in order to review anything that may have been missed along the way. We all know how that works when you're doing 3 things at once. You want to make sure that you have all that information available to you. He mentions the channel, runs his updates, and he once again records those actions in Planner. At 3:30, he gets notified in Teams that there's a bug that was posted in the channel from the Azure DevOps connector. He mentions his team and his experts to make sure that they can resolve that in time. At 4:30, he goes into the financial app to update resource leveling and costs based on all the projects that he's working on. And then at 6 o'clock, he receives an update from his through a notification, which is shown in his activity feed, that originates from the Azure DevOps world to notify him that the bug has been resolved. He updates his status report and posts it into the PMO team site, as well as mentioning the team to let them know that he's completed that task. So in speaking to the Microsoft 365 maturity model itself, this is Envision IT's Microsoft 365 maturity model. And our goal in creating this is really to look at the workloads and the apps that are used across the Microsoft 365 environment, and to build maturity in such a way that whether you are a 10-person organization, a 10,000 person or 100,000 person organization, you're able to leverage and create a path for yourself that is meaningful and creates a working model of maturity based on the slide that you're seeing here. So across the top, obviously, you see the workloads and the apps that you're familiar with on the left-hand side, and this works from the bottom up. The levels are informal, ad hoc, consistent, proactive, and optimized. Now, everybody wants to be optimized. Everyone wants to work as best as possible, or certainly we hope that everybody wants to work as best possible. The reality is we have to all crawl before we walk. And within the maturity context, if you're reading this left to right, bottom to top, you see how the development of the organization grows as you look to the various buckets that we've built out in order to show what the maturity can really look like. So nobody should look at this and say, wow, look, we're optimized. That's wonderful across the entire organization and across the model. That likely isn't the case. Hopefully most of you are somewhere around the middle where you've grown, you've developed, and you've worked with your team members to get into a consistent way, a consistent use scenario, a consistent platform. And now it's the onus is on you to work into proactive and then work yourselves into other modes from that point forward. If we look at the next slide and we look into Teams specifically, you'll see how Teams maturity is built, and there's our arrow across the bottom horizontally to show the growth and development. Now we've built an additional layer of users. So user 2, power user, super user, and admin are also growth roles that you can develop within your organization. Now, every organization has different names and titles for their staff, and obviously, you can overlay appropriate titles that work for you and your organization. But what we wanted to do was build on something that really starts with an average everyday user. What does someone do who is new to Microsoft Teams? Well, they may work very efficiently, but they may do very simple things. They might participate in team calls. They may be able to share their screen with others. They can chat with other users. They can participate in group chats, and they can use at mentions, which I've been talking about a fair bit over the last few slides, to draw attention to and from other users and colleagues within your organization. If that's what your users are doing, that's great. They're able to identify that informal section of the maturity model. That's fantastic. What can they do next? Well, now we can look into ad hoc, and I won't obviously read these out on a one-to-one to let you know, or excuse me, to read them from a growth perspective. But the idea here was to identify meaningful and manageable steps that will take you through the growth path and the maturity that can really be identified through the model and through everyday organizations such as yourselves. Now, if we look at Microsoft Stream is an interesting one from a growth perspective, because first of all, there's a lot of access questions that need to happen here. Many people who participate in meetings may not have the capability to actually record themselves and may not be concerned or worried about the business model behind how a stream recording is created, what happens along the way, how some of the feedback mechanisms are built in. But some of the things that can be included and incorporated, again, looking across the informal model, is knowing where to locate recordings after the fact. Why? Because that becomes your training content, that becomes your growth and adoption content from an organizational perspective, particularly when you're using stream recordings to train your staff, where you, much like this recording, will be put onto the environment for Envision, and it will be made available to other people following the recording. You want to make sure that your staff know where to locate those recordings once they're created, and also from a search and find perspective. Looking across the user scenarios again, looking how team members know where information is not only available but should be uploaded, how to add a tab for Stream in Microsoft Teams, looking to leverage the search functionality. The contextual search is very powerful, as Peter mentioned. And then hopefully something that most people don't have to do, but knowing that the recycling bin is there to recover any accidentally deleted videos with a 30-day limit. Now, if you look up to optimize across the top for Microsoft Stream in particular, you'll see how this grows. So some of the standardization concepts for content ownership and handling once a video is created and processed, those are some of the things that can be done, as well as creating formalized outreach and awareness campaigns in order to enable the adoption and training mechanisms that organizations are really trying to achieve now, particularly when so many of us are out of the office and we are left to our own devices as far as connecting is concerned. From a SharePoint maturity perspective, there's obviously a lot to be said for SharePoint maturity, and there's been a lot discussed for many years on how SharePoint is to be used and leveraged from a maturity perspective across an organization. What many people and users don't recognize is the fact that from a content perspective, all the content that you see in Microsoft Teams lives in SharePoint. So from a usage scenario perspective, from a security perspective, from a general comfort perspective, if you're familiar with SharePoint and its capabilities from a document management and content perspective, then there's certainly a lot of familiarity and comfort in the fact that all the content that lives in Microsoft Teams is built on a SharePoint backend. Now, again, looking across the bottom within the informal section, we want to make sure at a user level that staff are aware of file constructs and document libraries, as well as where information needs to live. We want to ensure that files are being shared correctly between team members, which means single source content or sole source content, and ensuring that team members and colleagues are sharing content at a one-to-one basis, meaning through and via link, as opposed to sharing source documents where you don't have one version of the truth and you end up with many versions of many documents and then a mess when you try to consolidate everything. Power users, we want to leverage SharePoint documents as well, and obviously make sure that they can access and download that information. We want to ensure that super users are sharing sites, not just documents, but sites on the growth path in order to look at internal and external use case scenarios as required. And then within the administrative constructs, looking at Microsoft 365 applications and ensuring that they are commonly leveraged for information sharing. That means that information and content is shared not just from a Microsoft Teams and SharePoint perspective, but also ensures that all information and all content across Microsoft 365 as a suite, as an enterprise, are leveraged within information sharing, basically to ensure that the apps and services that are best used for various workloads are done so accordingly. Looking at OneDrive, OneDrive is something that we find a lot of organizations are not 100% familiar with. Certainly they are from a storage perspective or from a backup and a when to use what perspective. I think OneDrive is one of the most underused and under-leveraged and utilized tools within the Microsoft 365 world. So again, looking at an informal level, we look at users who are aware that their files, first and foremost, are being backed up in OneDrive. That's something that's very important to note. Peter mentioned earlier, when a laptop or a device is lost or otherwise unavailable to the organization, we want to ensure that there's a seamless capability to get a new laptop, input some credentials, and ensure that all the information that was on the originating laptop is now available. And that's that first step to ensure that that backup is leveraged and ensure that that information becomes available. Moving across the model, we see that other users are able to access information from anywhere, whether they are in the office, whether they're mobile or on a desktop or laptop. We again want to make sure that content is distributed between team members via links. And then looking at super users, co-authoring is also something that's not only enabled, but used, needed, and available in order to ensure, again, looking at that first construct, that co-authoring from a one-to-many or a many-to-one relationship is there, meaning multiple people can leverage and edit documents from one file. And then within the administrative world, again, looking to see that content is updated whenever, wherever, knowing that that information is going to be online and available across the organization. When we look at OneNote, OneNote is something internally at Envision that we really leverage significantly. And it's something that, as well as OneDrive, is not leveraged too much within the organizational structure. So ensuring, again, looking at informal, that the navigation is properly used and sections and notebooks are constructed appropriately from the bottom up, ensuring that notebooks are protected with passwords where and when needed, that information is recorded in tabs and pages. And that's not recording from a stream perspective, but really just a document management perspective, ensuring that information is being added and edited into OneNote from a mature perspective, which means the processes and procedures are available and aware within the organization. Looking at the super users, we see that the page approach and the template approach is available to them, and they're aware of how to use things from a notebook section and page perspective, and they can really navigate through these things with simplicity. Administrators are using this a bit of a different skew to ensure that users are creating and sharing links. They're highlighting text and paragraphs, and they're ensuring that links to pages within the information is also available.
So Eric, why don't we give you a chance to catch your breath there. So there's a lot of stuff to cover, across different workloads as well as Microsoft 365 as a whole. And really what we're aiming to do as part of this is to help organizations figure out where they stand on that. And then how can you build change management, communication plans, training plans to help move your users along through there, which is twofold. It's what resources should we make available to the organization as a whole, and also how do we identify individuals within the organization that may be leaders or laggards on that spectrum. You do want to identify the leaders to say, hey, you're doing an awesome job, and we want to encourage you to become a champion within the organization and to pull other people along from that point of view. You may not want to be as direct with the laggards, but to say, okay, clearly they need some help here. How do we empower them to do more from that point of view? And a big part of that is learning pathways. So if you're not familiar with this is a suite of training videos and quick help that's available from Microsoft. And the cool thing is that while the content is always been updated and maintained from Microsoft, you actually deploy it into your own Microsoft 365 tenant. So it becomes a communication site in your SharePoint Online, which means you can tweak and tailor it. You can take out content that's not relative. I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, we don't tend to focus on Yammer a whole lot because we're not dealing with those massive organizations that are a better fit from that point of view. So we can just remove the whole Yammer section from a client's learning pathways because we don't want to confuse people with stuff that's not relevant to their organization. But beyond trimming things down, you can actually extend it as well. You can add your own content. So if there's particular things you want your staff to do that are organizational best practices, you can create your own videos, you can create your own quick help and actually make it part of learning pathways. So you get this content that's curated by Microsoft and also content that's created internally, typically within your communications or your training team, and made available for everybody to consume through there. So that idea of being future friendly as well as customizable is a really important piece in here. And this is just looking a little deeper in basically what learning pathways consists of is a number of playlists. I'm just starting out in Teams, or I want to understand how to work with posts and messages because I'm a pretty new user. I can drill into those playlists. I can watch quick videos, a minute to kind of in length. They're not onerous, and take you through those task-based training from that point of view. And some of the things that we'd like to extend learning pathways in general, not just for ourselves, but for our clients is, what are some of the critical rules of engagement that we see in terms of how you interact in this sort of new modern workplace. This idea that your activity feed becomes your new inbox, it's an important place to go from that point of view. But then understanding, that what to use when concept of, when should I use email, when should I use chat, when should I use channel conversations, as an organization, Envision IT has adopted the rule that if it's strictly an internal organization, it shouldn't be in email. And we've actually been very successful with that. We have very little internal email happening anymore. It all happens in Teams. But then beyond that, if it's sort of very, very short-lived information like, hey, Eric, are you on the call yet? That sort of thing goes in chat. But if it's got any sort of organizational knowledge, Eric and I are discussing the details of this page and this presentation, then that should go in a channel. So it's available not just to Eric and myself, but anybody else who may benefit from that. And things like reactions and at mentions, one of our rules is we use the like reaction to indicate read receipt. Eric at mentions me, I get a notification in my activity feed. I'll like that message, which doesn't mean approved. Eric may have said, hey, I'd like the next 6 months off as paid vacation. Are you okay with that? Like means, yeah, I saw it. We're going to chat about it. It doesn't mean book your holiday and you're good to go. So just understanding what those reactions mean within your organization, setting some parameters around that and communicating that throughout the organization. And really the Teams becomes the launch pad for all of your applications, using those tabs that I showed you and pulling that together. One other point I want to make here, if you haven't seen this yet, there is a new meeting experience in Teams. You have to turn it on user by user. You can probably set it up in group policy for a larger organization. It literally just came up in the last few days for us. We haven't gone too far with that. But if you go into your settings, if you click on your name in Teams, go into your settings, you should see this turn on new meeting experience. And what happens is that meetings that you're either participating in or launch out in their own window. The toolbar is kind of out of the way. It's no longer floating in the middle of the meeting. It's up at the top here. I like it. It's a nice new experience. I think it works really well. And the reality is when I'm in meetings, I'm often going back to my teams to look. Two separate windows works really well from that point of view. So just wrapping up, I know we're at the 12:45 mark here, so I'll wrap it up quick here. We are planning on launching out the end of this week a maturity model survey. So some of those scenarios that I started the session with, like how do you communicate, how do you collaborate on documents, are going to be in that survey. It's going to come as part of the follow-up email. So the recording and the presentation deck will be posting up on the site. So we'll have details in the follow-up email around that. It is a self-assessment. I'd encourage everybody on the webinar to participate in that. We're going to anonymize the results and share those in the next webinar so we can get a sense of where people are at on that spectrum. Just calling out, this page here was the main focus of the reminder email that got sent out earlier this week. This is going to be our go-to page for all of the content around the maturity model. So we've got the what to use when table in here. We've got some stuff around change management. There will be a link to the survey in here. We've got the webinar links in here. If you'd like to have a deeper discussion with Eric, to have a one-on-one to go into this to see how this works for your organization, his calendar is up here. So you can just pick a date, pick a time that works in your schedule that's available in Eric's, and you can go ahead and queue that up from there. What we're going to be extending this page with is a lot of the resources that we've been talking about. So the day in the life that Microsoft has been publishing that Eric took us through, we'll provide links to that, to learning pathways, to all the various different adoption resources, which are coming fast and furious from Microsoft. They're doing a nice job from that point of view. So with that, I'll just leave it on the slides here. So we've got the follow-on sessions. This is part 1 of 3. So next week is getting into the analytics side. So how do you actually measure this for your organization, whether it's using survey tools like what we're going to be launching, or actually using the inbox analytics that are available as part of Microsoft 365, or third-party tools like tyGraph. We're actually going to be having John White, who's the CTO of tyGraph. Their product is all about analytics and usage and adoption of 365. So he's a keen expert on that topic. And then the week following, August 12th, we're going to talk about planning for a successful migration. So if you actually haven't done that migration, or maybe you've only, say, turned on email, but you haven't moved off of file shares and into SharePoint or Teams, how do you plan that out and what does that look like? So stay tuned for those. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. Have a great rest of your day and talk to you next week. Thanks.